Lightning sliced through the dark sky over St. Lawrence like silver knives, momentarily illuminating the rain-soaked landscape of Mrs. Louise's ranch. The relentless rain pounded the roof of her century-old house, creating a chaotic symphony that echoed through every room. At 72, the widow had weathered countless storms on her property, yet something about that particular night made her heart beat faster, as if it sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. Wrapped in her thickest wool coat, Mrs. Louise grabbed her flashlight and decided to inspect the possible damage caused by the fierce winds. Her steps were firm despite her age, a result of decades spent training horses, a profession that demanded both physical strength and determination. The mud sucked at her rubber boots with every step, but she pressed on, illuminating the path with the yellow beam of her flashlight. Then she heard it. Amid the howl of the wind and the ceaseless drumming of the rain, a different sound cut through the night. Desperate neighs mixed with a dragged metallic clatter that sent the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Mrs. Louise stopped, trying to pinpoint the direction of the noise. Her eyes, honed from years of reading horse behavior, narrowed as another neigh echoed, this time more distinct. It was coming from the train tracks. Without hesitation, she altered her route, heading toward the railroad that bisected the lands near her property. The path was treacherous, especially on a night like this, but something in the animal's anguished cries compelled her to continue. Her long experience with horses had taught her to recognize when one was in real danger. As she approached the tracks, the sound became clearer. When she finally reached the open area where the rails cut through the landscape, her heart nearly stopped. There, trapped and thrashing in despair, was one of the most magnificent horses she had ever seen. It was a black stallion as dark as the night that enveloped him, his wet coat gleaming with each flash of lightning that split the sky. Even in his desperate state, his noble lineage was unmistakable. Long, muscular legs, an elegantly arched neck, and a posture that even in panic betrayed years of top-tier training. But what made Mrs. Louise catch her breath wasn't merely the animal's beauty. It was the marks, scars, some old and others fresh, marred his majestic body. And there was something even more disturbing. His hind leg was bound to the tracks, in a manner that could not have been accidental. Someone had deliberately tied the animal there, condemning him to a terrible fate. Her years of handling horses allowed Mrs. Louise to remain calm, even as her heart pounded with urgency. She knew the early morning train would be coming by any minute. She also understood that attempting to yank the animal free by force would only escalate his panic, potentially worsening the situation. With slow, deliberate movements, she approached the side of the horse, speaking in a soft, soothing tone even amid the storm. "Easy now, boy." "Easy. I'm going to get you out of here." The horse turned his head toward her, his large, dark eyes fixed on her with a mixture of fear and, could it be, hope? Reaching into the pocket of her coat, Mrs. Louise produced an old leather rope, an heirloom from her days of daily horse training. With fingers trembling not from fear but from controlled urgency, she began working on the snare that restrained the animal. Though the rain blurred her vision, decades of experience guided her steady hands. Time was against them. In the distance, a whistle pierced the night. The train was drawing near. Mrs. Louise worked even faster, using the rope as an improvised lever to loosen the restraint. As if understanding the gravity of the moment, the horse ceased his frantic thrashing, allowing her to work. Finally, when she managed to free his leg, the train's whistle grew louder and closer. With one last firm tug on the rope fashioned as a guide, Mrs. Louise led the horse away from the tracks. Seconds later, the train roared past, its carriages slicing through the night like a serpent of metal and light. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Let us know which city you're tuning in from, and we'll continue. The horse stayed by Mrs. Louise's side even after the train had passed, his breathing still heavy, yet his eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that bridged the gap between man and animal. The rain soon subsided into a fine drizzle, allowing a clearer view of the magnificent creature she had just rescued. Guiding him back to her property was no simple task. Though visibly exhausted, The horse still exhibited signs of mistrust, understandable, given what he had just endured. Mrs. Louise maintained a calm tone and gentle movements, employing techniques she'd refined over decades of working with frightened, traumatized horses. "Come on, boy," she murmured, noticing the positive response in his demeanor. "I've got a safe place for you to rest." The stable she selected to shelter the horse had been empty for years, yet it remained in good condition. It was one of many she'd used back when her ranch was a renowned training center throughout the region. As she prepared a cozy spot with fresh hay, memories of her glory days as a trainer flooded her mind. Under the brighter light of the stable, Mrs. Louise finally had the chance to examine her new guest more closely. The black coat, now beginning to dry, revealed a satin-like shine that one only sees in horses of superior lineage. His legs were well-proportioned, with sturdy joints hinting at years of professional training. But it was the scars that captured her attention, some old, others far too fresh. Then she noticed something that made her catch her breath, a subtle mark on the horse's flank, resembling a burn from hot iron. It was a symbol she recognized well. It belonged to Victory Stables, one of the most prestigious properties in the region. The name Richard Ferris, the owner of the stables, immediately came to her mind, accompanied by memories that were far from pleasant. Mrs. Louise knew all too well about Ferris's reputation. Behind the facade of a successful businessman and horse enthusiast lurked rumors of questionable practices. Rumors that, in her years as a trainer, she had preferred to ignore, focusing solely on her work. Now, staring at the marks of suffering on this magnificent animal, she felt a pang of guilt for her past silence. After ensuring the horse was comfortable and safe, with fresh water and ample hay, Mrs. Louise returned to her house. The rest of the night was spent awake, her mind tirelessly churning over the mystery. Why would someone abandon a horse of such stature to such cruelty? And why was an animal registered with Victory Stables in such dire straits? At the break of dawn, Mrs. Louise was already on the phone with Dr. Ronald, the veterinarian who had long served the area. His voice conveyed the urgency of the situation without revealing every detail. Years of experience had taught her to handle sensitive information with care. While waiting for the veterinarian's arrival, Mrs. Louise returned to the stable. The horse now appeared calmer, though he still maintained a wary posture. She took the opportunity to observe him more closely in the natural light streaming through the stable windows. There was something in his eyes, a mix of nobility and suffering that touched her soul. "You must have many stories to tell, don't you?" she murmured, approaching slowly. The horse perked his ears in her direction, recognizing her voice. "Don't worry. We'll find out what happened to you." Dr. Ronald's arrival was heralded by the sound of his pickup truck on the dirt road. Mrs. Louise had known him for years and trusted his professionalism and discretion. When he entered the stable and saw the horse, his normally calm expression turned into one of deep concern. "My goodness, Mrs. Louise," he said as he cautiously approached the animal, "where did you find this creature?" As she recounted the events of the previous night, the veterinarian began his examination. His experienced hands ran over the horse's body, documenting every mark and scar. At one point, he retrieved a small device from his briefcase, a microchip reader. The beep of the reader shattered the silence of the stable. Dr. Ronald frowned, while consulting the data on his tablet. "This is very strange, Mrs. Louise," he said, scratching his graying chin. "According to the official records, this horse was sold to a foreign buyer a few months ago. He should be in Europe by now." A shiver ran down Mrs. Louise's spine. Years of working with horses had taught her that irregular documentation often concealed dark secrets. "What is his name, Ronald?" "The records list him as Valor, a thoroughbred with an impressive history of victories in elite competitions," the veterinarian continued, his tone growing more serious with each new detail. "These scars, some align with rigorous training, but others—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Others suggest practices that no reputable stable should ever allow." Before they could continue their conversation, the sound of a powerful engine drew both their attention. A black pickup truck with tinted windows pulled up at the entrance of the property. A tall man, impeccably dressed in a suit, utterly out of place in this rural setting, stepped out of the vehicle. "Good morning," he said, his voice overly polite. "I'm Paul Mendez, a city inspector. We received a complaint about irregularities with animals on this property." Mrs. Louise, who knew every local official in St. Lawrence, had never seen this man before. "May I see your identification, please?" The supposed inspector hesitated for a split second, a gesture that did not escape Mrs. Louise's discerning eyes. "Of course, it's in the truck. But first, if you'll allow me, I need to conduct a quick inspection of the stables." "Without proper identification, there will be no inspection," Dr. Ronald interjected firmly. "Mrs. Louise, you know your rights, and I can attest that this property has always adhered to all regulations." The man shot a hard look at the veterinarian, his mask of courtesy faltering for a moment. Without another word, he turned on his heel and returned to his pickup truck, speeding away down the dirt road. "That wasn't an inspector," Dr. Ronald murmured as soon as the vehicle vanished in a cloud of dust. "Mrs. Louise, you need to be very careful. Something very wrong is happening here." As if to confirm his words, the next morning Mrs. Louise found a note affixed to the gate of her property. "It's not over," the message declared in bold block letters. That same afternoon, after much deliberation, Mrs. Louise decided to make a call she'd been putting off. She dialed the number of Julia Summers, a young biologist she had met at an animal welfare seminar the previous year. Julia had made a name for herself through investigative work, exposing abuse at high-end stables. "Julia, this is Mrs. Louise from St. Lawrence. We need to talk about Victory Stables." A moment of silence followed on the other end. "Mrs. Louise," Julia's voice was cautious, "have you discovered anything?" "Not only have I discovered something, I rescued him, and now I'm receiving unwelcome visits and messages." "Don't move," Julia said urgently. "I'm 2 hours away from St. Lawrence. I need to see this horse in person. And Mrs. Louise, lock up all the stables and do not let anyone in until I arrive." While waiting for Julia, Mrs. Louise spent time with Valor, the name she had come to call him. The horse was already showing clear signs of trust in her presence, approaching for gentle strokes and accepting the care she offered. During one such grooming session, she noticed something that had escaped her initial examination: a small scar at the base of his neck, the kind typically resulting from frequent injections. Her heart tightened at the implications of this discovery. The sound of an approaching car pulled her from her thoughts. Through the stable window, she saw a red Jeep pull up. A young woman with curly hair tied in a ponytail leapt from the vehicle. Julia Summers had arrived. The biologist's expression upon seeing Valor was one of sheer shock. "This can't be," she whispered, approaching the animal slowly. We all thought he had been sold. He's one of the most valuable horses in the country. And also one of the most mistreated, judging by these scars," replied Mrs. Louise, indicating the marks. Julia produced a small notebook from her bag. "Mrs. Louise, you have no idea how significant this rescue is. For the past 3 years, I've been investigating a scheme involving several elite stables. Prize-winning horses disappear mysteriously, are declared sold abroad. But in reality," Julia opened her notebook, revealing pages of meticulous notes, photos, and newspaper clippings. "Victory Stables is at the heart of it all. Richard Ferris built a reputation as a champion breeder, but the cost of that fame is far higher than people imagine." As she spoke, the young biologist spread documents across an improvised table in the stable. There were records of competitions, astonishing results from horses that overnight began exhibiting extraordinary performances. "Doping," Julia explained, pointing to the scar on Valor's neck. "But not with ordinary substances. They developed a special cocktail, virtually undetectable in routine tests. The problem is that the side effects are devastating. When a horse begins showing signs of collapse, they then fabricate an international sale," Mrs. Louise interjected, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together in her mind. "Exactly. But Valor, he was special. The most valuable stallion in the stable, a champion in international competitions. He must have taken a fortune in bribes to cover up his tests." Mrs. Louise caressed the horse's neck, feeling him relax under her touch. Why leave him on the tracks? Why not simply do to him what they did to the others? Julia bit her lip hesitantly. I believe it was meant as a message. In recent weeks, someone inside the stable began leaking information to the press. Small details, but enough to make Richard Ferris nervous. This, she gestured toward Valor, seems like a warning to anyone daring to speak. A sudden noise outside startled them both. It was just a branch tapping on the window, but it served as a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. "We need concrete evidence," Julia said, gathering her documents. "Without it, it's our word against that of one of the most influential businessmen in the state. And how do we obtain that proof?" A determined smile spread across the young woman's face. "Victory Stables is hosting a major equestrian event next weekend. All the top breeders and buyers will be present. And she paused significantly, to have secured press credentials." Before Mrs. Louise could respond, the smell of smoke invaded the stable. Through the slightly open door, they saw a column of black smoke rising from one of the outbuildings at the far end of the property, precisely where Mrs. Louise stored all her old records and documents from her training days. "My goodness!" exclaimed Mrs. Louise, dashing toward the outbuilding with Julia close behind. Fortunately, the main structure of the ranch was equipped with an antiquated yet effective fire suppression system, a relic from its days as an active training center. With the help of neighbors who spotted the smoke, they managed to control the flames before they could spread further. But the damage was done. Years of records, photographs, and documents had been reduced to ashes. For Julia, the message was clear. Someone wanted to erase any connection Mrs. Louise might have had with the stable's past. "That wasn't an accident," declared the biologist as she examined the smoldering remains. "They're getting desperate." Mrs. Louise fell silent for a moment, her expression hardening with a resolve that Julia had never seen before. "So that's how they want to play? Fine. I've spent my entire life caring for horses, building a reputation on trust and respect. I'm not going to hide now." "What are you thinking?" "You said you got credentials for the event. At the stable, right? Well, I think it's time for Richard Ferris to meet an old acquaintance." Julia's eyes widened. "That's very risky. They've already shown what they're capable of. Precisely why we can't back down. We need to be smarter than they are." Mrs. Louise paused, decades of strategic training coming to the forefront of her mind. "You have your cameras and reporting gear. Let's give them exactly what they expect. A young journalist covering the prestigious event. Meanwhile, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Let us know which city you're watching from, and we'll continue. Victory Stables was in full swing. Colorful pennants adorned the impeccably maintained stables, and members of the National Equestrian Elite strolled through the manicured gardens, champagne flutes in hand. To an unobservant onlooker, it would appear to be just another social event on the equestrian calendar. Julia moved among the guests with her camera and press credentials, documenting forced smiles and superficial conversations. Yet her real attention was on the details that everyone else missed. The locked doors, the outlying stables, the nervous glances exchanged by some staff members, the suspicious comings and goings of certain individuals. Mrs. Louise, for her part, had already stirred up a bit of commotion with her arrival. Many still remembered her as one of the most respected trainers in the region. Richard Ferris, the host, couldn't conceal his surprise at seeing her. "Mrs. Louise," he said, approaching with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "What a pleasant surprise. It's been too long since we last met." "Long enough for many things to change, Richard," she replied steadily. "Your stable has grown impressively since then." "Times change. We must adapt, don't we?" There was a veiled threat in his tone, although some prefer to cling to outdated methods. Before Mrs. Louise could respond, a young woman stepped forward. Marina Ferris, Richard's daughter, was well known in equestrian circles not only for her riding talent, but also for her passion for animal welfare. Her face lit up upon recognizing Mrs. Louise. "Mrs. Louise, it's wonderful to see you here." The warm embrace she offered the former trainer did not escape her father's notice. His forced smile faltered for just a moment. "Marina," Richard interjected, "I'm sure Mrs. Louise would like to mingle a bit, catch up with old friends." "Actually," Marina interrupted, "I'd love to show you our new facilities. You must see our training center, Mrs. Louise. Before Richard could protest, Marina was already leading Mrs. Louise away from the party. Once they were alone, the young woman began speaking quickly in a low voice. I know about Valor. I know what they did to him and the others. Her hands trembled slightly. I have proof, documents, videos, records of all the substances they used. I'd been gathering the courage to expose it, but when I learned what they did to Valor, Mrs. Louise's heart raced. Was it you who started leaking the information? Marina nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I couldn't stand it any longer. These horses, they're my life. To see what they do to them. She took a deep breath, regaining her composure. There's one more thing. Today's event isn't just an exhibition, there will be a private auction. Horses that were supposedly sold abroad will be secretly traded with other stables that use the same practices. At that moment, Julia appeared discreetly in the corridor. Marina immediately recognized her. They had met at previous animal protection events. Everything is set, Julia whispered. The cameras are in position. It won't even be necessary, Marina said, her voice gaining surprising strength. Enough hiding, enough waiting. I'm going to expose it all right now. Marina, think carefully, warned Mrs. Louise. The consequences... Consequences, the young woman smiled sadly. The real consequences are what these animals endure every day, and I feel as responsible as my father for having stayed silent until now. Without waiting for an answer, Marina turned and strode decisively toward the center of the event, where a small stage had been set for official speeches. Mrs. Louise and Julia exchanged worried glances before following her. Richard Ferris was in the midst of his welcome speech when his daughter ascended the stage. The smile on his face froze as he took in Marina's determined expression. Marina, what? I'm sorry, Dad, she said, her voice amplified by the microphone and echoing throughout Victory Stables, but I can no longer be complicit in this. And then, before the entire national equestrian elite, Marina Ferris began to reveal every sordid detail of the scheme that had transformed Victory Stables into an empire built on the suffering of innocent animals. The chaos that followed her revelation was instantaneous. Shocked guests, some indignant, others visibly nervous, began to disperse. Richard Ferris, his face flushed with fury, attempted to silence his daughter, but it was too late. Julia was already live-streaming the events on social media, and several journalists in attendance were recording every word. Marina, with a courage that surprised even herself, presented documents, played videos on her cell phone, and disclosed names and dates. The carefully constructed web of lies began to unravel. The stables, someone shouted from the crowd. They're moving the horses. Mrs. Louise and Julia exchanged looks. While everyone was distracted by the revelations, Ferris's henchmen were hastily trying to herd the horses slated for an illegal auction into a transport truck. I'm going after them, Julia declared, sprinting toward the outlying stables. Mrs. Louise followed, her years of experience with horses guiding her steps. When they reached the back of the property, they saw 3 men attempting to force a group of frightened horses into a truck. They're in a panic, Mrs. Louise murmured, watching the agitated animals. If they keep forcing them like this, someone's going to get hurt. Then an old memory surfaced. Years ago, she had developed a special technique to calm nervous horses during storms. It was risky, but it might just work now. Approaching slowly, she began whistling a soft, rhythmic melody. The agitated horses turned their ears toward her. Gradually, they began to calm, responding to the call that spoke directly to their instincts. The men, unprepared to handle the situation, hesitated. That moment was all Julia needed to signal the reinforcements she had strategically positioned around the property. Activists and animal advocates who were waiting for her cue. Within minutes, police cars arrived, their sirens slicing through the afternoon air. Richard Ferris, who had been attempting to flee in his imported car, was intercepted at the property's exit. The following hours were intense. Veterinarians were summoned to examine all the horses. Documents were seized and testimonies were collected. Marina, though emotionally drained, remained resolute, providing every piece of information the authorities required. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Louise returned to her ranch. Valor greeted her with a gentle neigh, as if acknowledging that something momentous had just occurred. Stroking his neck, she realized that the rescue on that stormy night had been only the beginning of something much larger. In the weeks that followed, the revelations about Victory Stables sparked a revolution in the equestrian world. Other establishments were investigated, abusive practices were questioned, and regulations were reinforced. Mrs. Louise's ranch acquired a new mission. With the help of Julia and Marina, who had definitively broken away from her father after the revelations, the property was transformed into Valor Sanctuary, a haven dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating horses victimized by exploitation. Valor, the black stallion who had nearly lost his life that stormy night, became the living symbol of a new era. His scars, once marks of suffering, now told a story of resilience and hope. On a tranquil afternoon, as she watched a group of rescued horses grazing freely in the sanctuary's fields, Mrs. Louise reflected on how life could change in an instant. A single act of courage, a decision not to ignore the suffering of another, could spark a wave of transformation. The sanctuary soon became a reference center, welcoming visits from students, researchers, and horse enthusiasts from across the country. Every rescued animal carried a unique story, and each successful recovery was celebrated as a collective victory. "You know," Julia remarked one day while helping care for the animals, "sometimes I think Valor wasn't just rescued. That night, he chose us for a greater mission." Mrs. Louise smiled as she watched the majestic black stallion gallop freely across the sanctuary's fields. "Maybe you're right. Sometimes you have to lose yourself in the storm to find your true path." The end. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mrs. Louise and Valor has touched your hearts. To continue this journey of moving tales that celebrate courage and compassion, we've prepared a special playlist filled with equally captivating narratives. You can find it by clicking to the left. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button on the video. Every day we share unique stories that explore life's complexities and the transformative power of love and determination. Share your own stories of overcoming adversity in the comments. We can't wait to hear them.